Okay, happy Friday, everybody. This is Hot Boys Talk Show. I'm Daniel Alice,
And I'm Tamsin Elliott.
and today uh, we have the distinct pleasure of having Nina Shaker on our show. Nina, you're a friend of ours. Um, we've known you for a
From
while now.
school.
From school, yes, from school. Now you're in a different part of the world, but you were in LA for a while. You're in Michigan now. But we asked Philip last week about how he would describe himself, and we kind of want to put that question to you to start off our introduction to your work. So, how would you describe yourself? What you do? Um, would you say you're a composer? Would you not? What are your how do you define you?
I feel like that's always like the hardest question. Um
Gotta give it up.
yeah, I think that you know, I I always will associate myself with like the community I'm from and my family. And so for me I really identify as being like the daughter of immigrants. And so my parents immigrated from India like in the 80s, and I grew up here. I was born in Detroit. And but that sort of identity of being um first generation is always a tricky one, but it's a big part of who I am. And um so I would say like a lot of my work is kind of filtered through that lens of the sort of like immigrant first generation identity. And because of those experiences, I think um just the way that being like of a different ethnicity, in a especially in a neighborhood that I grew up was like very white. So for me, like being in that kind of environment, it made me really aware of my identity in like kind of a painful way to
Mm,
start off with. And I mean, eventually I kind of learned to love feeling like that and really like being aware of that. And so I think now in terms of my work now, a lot of this has kind of come out of a place of feeling like, oh, I didn't totally conform to certain
Yeah.
ideals of what an artist was supposed to be. And I mean, even for me to just say like artist and Indian American or artist and Asian American itself is like a big challenge, I think, just culturally, because like I think as artists or Asian Americans, we feel a lot of this cultural pressure of like, are the arts even a valid like career choice,
mm,
And so like even having that in the same sentence, and especially for me being Indian American, like there's very few. I think I remember one of my first mentors who was Indian, like when we first met, she's like, "You're number five that I've met." So like there's hardly any of us. But because of that, I think it's made me really aware of like myself and the way that I work as an artist. And so I think a lot of my work is kind of distilled through this, is really focused around this idea of identity and really focused on like the intersections of me and my community, but also with anybody I work with, anybody I interface with in terms of performers, audiences, the space that I'm in, all of that. And I think that's really part of the work. So I really view myself in this sort of like formula of like, if a work, like the formula of a work is like a function of like all these different parameters of like me, who else is engaging with it, and like the space, everything like that, but also like a function of time. And so me
Yeah.
having this sort of perspective of being like an artist, like that's all part of who I am.
yeah. Kind of related to the function idea too, it might be good to say that your background initially in school was doing music as well as engineering. Is that correct?
Yeah, chemical engineering.
And so, do you feel like that kind of plays into the things you're interested in now, or has that sort of taken a different path for you? Music's more the focus, or is it more something else?
Yeah, I think it did. I it's so funny because the way we think about like career path, it tends to
Yeah.
be in this real like dichotomy of like, this is what I'm doing. And there's a lot of pressure, I think, especially amongst like musicians or in the art world, of not having a day job, or like not having
Not deviating.
Exactly. Yeah, because it somehow makes you like less committed as an artist. Like there's always this notion like, oh, if you could do something else, like then do that instead, which I think is a really flawed notion. But part of the reason I did chemical engineering initially was like a compromise, if I'm being purely honest, because my parents were really afraid of me not being able to support myself in an arts
Yeah, yeah.
career. So I did chemical engineering. It was also like a really strategic choice, specifically chemical engineering, because it was like the one of all the engineering majors, it was like the broadest one, and you could get like a job anywhere. So it was like a really specific, and it also like I had thought it was like, I used to love chemistry, and like chemical engineering honestly has nothing to do with chemistry. Like nobody knows that until too late. And you're like already fulfilled half the degree. Yeah, and you're like, oh shoot, I should have done like material science or something else that was more chemistry. So yeah, but then like the more as I went in the degree, I mean, I'm also kind of stubborn, and I was like, I'm gonna finish this thing. I'm gonna finish both my degrees, and I don't care. But then, like as I did it, I am really happy. Like I was, even though I was not sleeping for 4 or 5 years, I was really happy that I did it, because just the way we talk about issues in like my engineering classes was like radically different than the way we talked about stuff in my like music classes. And like I have this really vivid memory of like when the Flint water crisis was happening, in Michigan. Like I had friends who were wanting to do these like activist concerts. They're like, we're gonna raise money, but then they didn't really understand what was going on in Flint. And then like in my engineering class, like we had entire class periods devoted to like literally what was happening physically, and why that was like the corrosion, and why all that was occurring. So I think having this sort of multiple dimensional understanding of something is really inform a lot of like my current work. So even though I don't do it anymore, I used to work at Bounty for a little bit. Like even though I don't do that anymore, I think it's still part of who I am.
It sounds like in all of these things, it's not been an easy situation, but somehow your signature seems to be having been like faced with the boundaries and the comparisons, and having to make a choice, and having experience in both sides of things. And I think seeing the contrast between yourself and the people around you, and having just such a clear experience. I feel like a lot of I've talked to a lot of classical musicians in particular, especially because at Bard we had to do a double major thing. So there's a lot of conversation about like people being afraid of deviating from the classical music path if they liked their other major too much, And it seemed like the much more like straightforward path of the people who, kind of half-assed their other major, because they were like, this needs to be the most important thing. And I love to hear that, for some people there's that fear of even entertaining another path, but you like really went through a whole degree, and you actually did do a simultaneous path, and I think that gives you sort of it's kind of past the point of no return.
Well, I mean, I did feel repercussions from it a little bit, because I know that, well, like my undergrad was really interesting, because I was not only doing a double major, but then like we were required to also like take regular performance lessons. And the way that the flute studio worked there was that like everybody who was like flute was their instrument was studying with the professor. Like it was in the studio, and we would do like the same ensembles and play the same repertoire. I did a flute recital also. So I always felt like it was not only that I was a composition major trying to be in all these like spaces of, like when we would do orchestra auditions, like for like the placement and stuff, like not only was I a composer, but also I was doing chemical engineering. And
Yeah.
so like sometimes I would feel from some of the, like especially from like the orchestra faculty and stuff like that, like they didn't really take me seriously. And I don't totally blame them, just because they like were focused on the performance majors and whatever. But then I also always felt really singled out, especially because I'm Indian. Like there's not really supposed to be Indians here. And like I'm a double major in a science field. Like they all knew that I probably would just go in that direction, even though I knew I knew pretty early on that I wasn't going to end up like pursuing a career in engineering.
Yeah.
So like I definitely felt that, and I think it partly like race and like made it even worse, like feeling like I was not really taken as seriously. um so it's a real challenge, and I always sympathize with students now who are doing double majors. And I mean, I think there's more and more doing that now, which I'm happy. And but I also, there's some people that really do love different things, and it's not even just like a capitalist, like I want to sustain myself. Like there's some people who really have different interests, and like if there is an opportunity, especially if you're paying for a degree, like to kind of
Like the
make the most
education
of
is
it,
for you. Yeah.
I think that's something that's always a good thing.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's being understood a little bit more broadly now, that especially as a creator, like having a diverse amount of like input about the way that your brain thinks about things, and the sources of inspiration and just experience. Like the more that you invest in other aspects of life, it's like the more it gives back to the things that you make. And that's, yeah.
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 It seems like a good segue into some of your work, even to take a look at how these different references, different reference points are making their way into your music. We wanted to play Above the Fray, um, which uh, maybe we could just give a bit of like a summary or like information about, which is that Above the Fray is a piece that you wrote for Jack Quartet, which is a quartet on the East Coast.
Is it a
Working,
national sawdust project as well? Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. And maybe after we play some, you can say more about that collaboration. But one of the big things you wrote in your program notes for the piece is that part of this is built off of a Bach piece. So, a Baroque composer's music. So we thought we could play just a bit of the Bach initially to give people a sense of what it's like, and then we'll play a couple excerpts or an excerpt from Above the Fray to get into the music.
Alrighty. Oh, it's okay. It never lands.
Yeah.
Okay, shush.
Yeah, the Baroque music's gonna just keep going.
Keep noodling.
But here is Above the Fray, which is your work for Jack Quartet. We'll play hopefully just like a minute and a half of that. Try to get to this drop that we really like from it.
Real nice drop. Oh, okay. Sorry. need to figure out how to do a fade out. It's so rough.
Yeah. It's hard to stop too.
Like
but-
the Bach, it keeps going.
Yeah, it keeps going. I'm like, land somewhere.
Right, right.
Oh.
But yeah, I think, on multiple levels, you can hear that Bach, as the influence. And I know in the program notes, you also wrote kind of your, in some ways, critiquing classical music and Bach and the use of it. So our first question just about that piece is kind of what led you to choose that Bach piece as a source material? And obviously, much earlier today, you just laid out for us a lot of this is coming from the culture that you find around you within classical music, and then your own intersection with that. So, yeah, we're just interested in that. Like, what leads us to choose Bach, or what leads you to choose Bach for this piece?
And also, like this Bach, it's derived from that prelude, correct?
Yeah, it's from that prelude.
That's like the most emblematic, like stock music, classical.
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Right. Well, that's part of why I picked that piece in particular. Yeah. But yeah, so like I think a lot of stuff that I've been working on recently has been kind of playing with this idea of like sampling in a different way. Whether maybe not necessarily always in a like totally stereotypical like electronic way, but like just sort of this idea of like repurposing material and like what does the context of that material mean. And especially because like me being so, I mean, I think this is like all music is really a product of these intersecting identities, but like if there's a way that I can show that in a concrete way, like that was part of the reason why I've been exploring this idea of sampling, because in a way it's me reclaiming like some other work that in some ways might have been taking up a space that I couldn't occupy, or it occupies a certain sort of position of social capital. There's all this like institutional like devotion towards this, but in a way I feel like a power of reclaiming that material and me using it in a way. It's almost like when I'm thinking of like I feel like right now the word appropriation has become this like really scary landmine issue. But I think that in reality what makes an like appropriation can be something that is done is a beautiful thing if it's an exchange, right? If there's some sort of like intersection between that and you're focusing on that intersection rather than really something that is like taking away or like shifting power, there's like an exchange that's involved that could be really amazing and then really deepen the understanding of what identity means and how our identity sits in relation to something else. So for this piece in particular, so this National Sawdust was commissioning pieces for this project for specifically to fund freelance artists during the pandemic. And so around that time that this commission was happening, and like when it was first announced, like that was kind of when all the George Floyd protests were going on. And so like I was just kind of like dumbstruck by how many classical organizations are putting out these videos of them like, let's heal. And then they were just like playing Bach. And then like also just with the pandemic, like there's these people like putting out these videos, and I just was like, wow, this is so bad. Like, this is so missing the point. And so so then part of me was like, well, if we're all, and also like this sort of notion that like, oh, we're all in this together and we're all experiencing like the great equalizer or whatever people have said about the pandemic. Like, no, we're all feeling this really differently depending on what, like, how much money we make, what kind of job we have.
Whether we have a place to live.
Right. What if we have a place to live, what even like in terms of racial communities, like there's different like levels of COVID numbers in different communities. If we work in a hospital, there's all these different elements to it. Or if somebody in our family is sick, there's just like so many factors and we're not experiencing it the same way. So, and also the funny thing was the way that people I think that the way that a lot of classical, when I'm saying classical, I mean like Western classical institutions have kind of responded to the pandemic and like not being able to make music in the same way. Like I think they're so resistant to really like using this as a creative opportunity. And like there were so many of these click track pieces that were happening. And so like it's such a watered down thing when we're all like, oh, I'm gonna play my little flute part in this Tchaikovsky movement and just play it with a click, do, do, do. Okay. And then like somebody else is recording their part.
Like, put it together.
Right. And just put it together. Like that is like not the point of this. But what I was trying to do with this piece was really make it like a pandemic specific, like this is for remote performance. And so I kind of had this idea like, well, what if, and I didn't end up doing this, but it was like fueling what this was. What if everybody had a totally different click track that was like changing at different rates, and you know, or people were like tuned at different, you know, to different notes, and so in a way that would actually be easier to pull off in a pandemic situation where we're all playing remotely than it being in the same space. I mean, Jack Quartet could do either probably. So, but like, you know, in general, like what if this was like built into the work? And then that kind of also related to my idea of this sort of identity thing of like, we're all experiencing this really differently. And like over time, like our identity is going to be changing throughout this whole experience as our circumstances change. And so I wanted to do with this piece, like kind of making fun of Bach, but like having 12 different layers. So there's like 3 different violin 1 parts, 3 different violin 2 parts, you know, so on, where like everybody's like going through the material totally differently, working their way through the prelude. So it's kind of supposed to be this like remote piece that is related to all these issues of identity we're talking about. But yeah, I wonder like for a classical institution to do this piece, like it also like even in the score, a lot of it's a time-based score. And there's like Gregorian chant notation kind of thing that I use where it's like it's also supposed to be like the history of like Western classical, you know, where it goes from the Gregorian chant
for a lot
to, like,
of things.
So yeah, I don't know, it's interesting how different. I'm curious if another quartet were to play it, like some like especially a quartet that comes from a more like traditional, like we play Bach or whatever. Are there even Bach? I don't even know.
I was gonna ask actually, I really love what you said about appropriating in a situation where it's an exchange. And my dumb brain said, well, what's Bach ever given to you? But I actually want to ask that, like, what do you feel if you like, you know, if you have it all, like, what do you feel like you've received from Bach?
Yeah, well, part of the, I mean, I kind of like just grabbed some material for this piece. I mean, in a way, because the power dynamic lets me do that. But then also, you know, and this is something that I think gets missed a lot when we talk about like all these DEI initiatives that people are doing, is that, you know, we all have really different things that got us into music. And I don't fault anybody, even though we could say like that a lot of Western, like even like this whole system of Western tonality is rooted like from the church. Like there's all this like oppression that's rooted in a lot of like what that the field is, you know, of classical music. But then I also like, for better or for worse, through colonization, has kind of spread everywhere. Like, and it's infiltrated like so many different kinds of music around the world. And for better or for worse, you know, some people really find joy in listening to Bach, even if they're somebody who was probably marginalized by the genre and by was like affected by this colonization. And you can't really fault anybody for doing that. And I think that that's really important, that like artists have this agency of like identifying with the community that they want to be part of and really making the work that they want to be making in a way that, like, you know, if there's, you know, for me, like as an Indian American, if I found some kind of joy in playing Beethoven, like I think that that's almost more justifiable
Hmm.
than like somebody that is part of like a sort of like privileged, you know, thing, like enabling that. You know, I think it's okay that people might find joy in that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if I really like found joy in Bach growing up. I didn't really listen to Bach that much actually.
Yeah.
So
At the same
but,
time, though, my impression when listening to this is that I didn't even know that it was from this Bach cello suite, because I obviously didn't read the program note close enough. But one thing that I think is sort of, you know, you almost like one up him is that this one in particular has this sort of like lifting up da 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 da, like this sort of like throwing up in the air, and it's sort of like, you know, above the fray. Like there's a way that you push this material into sort of like holding up and keeping rising, and not just sort of like in a registral way. It's hard to describe, and I find that sort of, even if,
yeah.
you know, you feel like you're, you know, you're beating Buck up a little bit, you know, you still sort of beat him at his game a
Yeah.
bit.
I mean, there's a little bit of like I think what's interesting about this piece, I mean, I wonder as a listener who didn't write the piece, like other people's perceptions, but I do think that like when I listen to it, there is like a strange. You can't really tell if I'm like critiquing Bach or if I'm like glorifying Bach, which I
Hmm.
think is like part
Yes.
of the point.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, even within myself, like I have conflicting feelings sometimes about Bach. I mean, I don't know, maybe not. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I did grow up playing a little bit of Bach, I think,
Right.
or sort of,
Especially
but
Yeah. Related to that, it's something you said earlier really stuck with me, that there are power dynamics that um, change what the music means. And as you've laid out, um, Bach is something that you would have been experiencing, and so many of us experience because of um, like the environment, the after effects of colonization, and just the ubiquity. You know, Bach is everywhere, or classical music's sense of what it is everywhere. Whether or not you listen to it, I think you kind of we have some experience with classical music, and as a result of that, it's different for you to take Bach and use it in a piece. The power dynamics are different than um, other situations. You mentioned appropriation, and I think the argument can't really be made that you're necessarily appropriating Bach because the power dynamics are just so vastly different from what often is the object of discussion when we're talking about cultural appropriation. So, my question, to get to a little bit more of a philosophical place, is kind of
philosophical Monday.
philosophical. This is, there's like a warning here, feels a warning. But I wonder if you could map out, you know, in your own way of viewing it, like what the power dynamics are when we do grab from a reference. Because you know, you and I have talked before, you know, offline about how power dynamics are important to you to think about when you're creating the work. So what does it mean to, what are the politics really of like referencing something, and what layers do we have to think about in terms of power, culture, and all of that?
yeah, there's a ton of layers. And I think it goes beyond um I think a lot of times when we think about cultural appropriation, we're so focused on this like really surface level understanding of what
Hmm.
like culture means, how that affects the art. And you know, like obviously there's money and there's like sort of capital capitalism, it influences what these power dynamics are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And where does the money flow? And that I think actually influences something that I think is not talked about a lot,
Hmm.
which is you know, when you're an artist that comes from like some sort of marginalized identity, um that I think people are so, when they think about like inclusion or like diverse programming, I think people are thinking on like in this sort of like quota system and just thinking, oh, like I need to represent this person. But you know, the challenges that we are facing is it's much beyond just like, oh, I didn't get this grant, like why is this institution
Hmm.
not giving me this? Why, you know, it's actually like a really deep psychological thing that affects the art that we make. And so I've been thinking about this a lot. Um like I'm gonna not name this person, but a really well-known composer who's won a ton of stuff. She wrote a piece for, or she was working with this really famous singer, and she kind of just like drew triangles on a page and handed it to her. And like, I mean, of course, I think that there's like really interesting creative implications of doing something like that. And like, there's this sort of reshifting of composer and performer agency, which I mean, I think there's a lot in there. But like, honestly, I was so mad when that happened because all I could think about was like, I can't imagine any Asian American artist ever doing that. Like
Hmm.
that's all I could think. And
Yeah.
I was just like, because you know, we feel this sort of like cultural pressure. Like we're not only trying to prove ourselves and that our career and like the work we were making is valuable to our own culture, but then we're also like trying to be like, oh, I'm gonna prove myself in every single
Yeah.
commission I do. I'm gonna work so much harder just to prove also to like white audiences and like the white institution. And like this, we even just like in terms of experimentation and like having this sort of freedom in terms of getting to make what we want to do. Like I don't think people talk about that at all when they
Hmm.
talk about representation. Like it's so much beyond just like a numbers game. It's all about like, and it informs the work that we make, you know. Like I don't have that same kind of freedom to experiment and have this like, you
Hmm.
know, freedom of just trying things, for like drawing triangles on a page for some really famous performer and not feeling like judged for that,
Hmm.
the way that white artists or people who are in a position of power have. So I think when we're talking about all this stuff about appropriation and things like that, a lot of this like experimental power dynamic that like never gets talked about, I think that's like part of it.
Hmm. Yeah, it sounds like the demand um, is different for a person of color who's working in these spaces, because it's not just about, as you said, the job. There are like getting the commission or getting the money. It's also these other layers that are symbolic, or um, uh, ways to move around in the world that really aren't accessible to certain people. And before we, I guess, move on to more of your music, I
Talk
did want
about.
to ask if you have like any thinkers, any writers that have sort of helped you through thinking about either cultural appropriation or power dynamics. We kind of want to try to give people some resources for thinking through this, if you have any that you feel are helpful. So,
Yeah. I think, you know, George Lewis is always good to read. Um, I just, you know, I like George Lewis because he just says it bluntly, doesn't really sugarcoat anything,
mm,
which I think is really great. You know, also I for who I am and like conceptually the way I think, even in terms of like my own sort of gender identity, for me, like Judith Butler has been
mm,
helpful in terms of like
yeah,
me really thinking about kind of the way I approach, even just approaching like my gender or my sexuality, and
yeah.
the sort of like spectralness of it. And yeah, I'm starting to think of other people that have really influenced me. Um,
I
I feel
appreciate
like
you
George Lewis
sharing.
was the first.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing Judith Butler too, because she's working beyond music as just a discipline. And I feel that Judith Butler's mainly working in critical theory, I believe, and um, mainly working around gender and researching that as it plays out in the world. And I think, as you said before, just the interdisciplinariness that's necessary now really means, I think, that we have to look beyond the people who are in the field of music, right? And so I appreciate you sharing Judith Butler's work as generative for you. So yeah, we'll
Yeah, and
try
I
and
mean, of
link.
course, with Judith Butler, like, I mean, Judith Butler's also faced a lot of criticism for stuff that,
Sure.
but like, I think I've always found I've pulled a lot from, I was just talking today in another meeting about like linguistics, and like there's like this whole divide in the linguistics community of like, does language inform culture, or is that like a myth? And like me reading about that's called like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or something. And
Yes.
like, yeah, and like reading about that has been really interesting, and just
Yeah.
different perspectives on that. So
I've watched some YouTube videos on that.
yeah.
Now, I think we could all use a hug. So we're gonna turn to some questions about your piece Hush, which I believe you wrote for a microtonal piano duo. What are the names again? I should have
Ray
them.
Calais. It was Vicky Ray and Aaron Calais.
Yeah. We'll just play a little bit. Let's share screen. I don't need to say that out loud. I'm such a person.
Zoom world. Hard to stop. Hard to stop.
Hard to stop. So I have a sort of particular question about this piece. So when you presented this piece in our forum back when you first wrote it, and you sort of started off by saying that you really needed a hug, so you wrote yourself a hug. And I was wondering, usually in this sort of Hollywood way of saying things, they're like, oh, artists do art to express themselves. Like that is some like there's a valve, expressing pus. But
just notes coming out.
And that sort of, it's like a vague benefit to oneself. But in this, I was very interested that you're conscious of the kind of benefit that you wanted from the experience of writing it and from the experience of listening to it. And so I do you often think about what the piece is doing for you when you work?
Yeah, I this piece I wrote, I was like really homesick. That was like kind of why I wanted a hug. So, but which now is funny because I don't leave the house. But now I need the opposite.
Now you need a hug because you're stuck at home.
I should just play it backwards or something. But yeah, I just felt like, the way that we work through, I don't know, I feel like especially in our field recently, there's been this sort of like trauma porn kind of thing where it's
Mm,
like people
Yeah.
really want, they just really want people to like, I don't know, bare their soul, but in a way that like could actually be really hurtful for the artist that's making it. And
And
really, and
potentially
just like
for audience
reliving.
members.
Uh-huh. And also for, yeah, for audience members too.
Yeah.
Um, and it's just like it's a little bit toxic, So I think that the way I've had some like earlier pieces that they're really personal. I always felt like self-conscious that I was like being like new music Taylor Swift or something, and like being like, this is my diary, and just saying everything. But in a way, like I found it kind of powerful for me to just like do that, like just put it out there, and like thinking, but like be really mindful of the process and like what I wanted to share and what I didn't want to share, like what was off limits, and like drawing those boundaries for myself, and like using the process of working through something as a way that was like providing clarity for me rather than something that was like kind of victimizing me in the process. So with this piece, yeah, like, this piece I wrote also in a much more like improvisatory manner, and
mm,
which is honestly not something that I normally do. So I like by me just sitting and like fiddling around on my floor because don't I didn't have any space in my apartment, so the keyboard was on the floor. I had like a specific angle for like the outlets to all line up.
The stars on the
Yeah, and so like but that process of me just like sitting and doing that was really therapeutic. And I, with going back to this idea of reference, and obviously when you hear that like chill sound, like it's such a specific connotation, and everybody thinks of Mr. Rogers, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I watched a documentary with Mr. Rogers, or that movie, the Tom
Yeah.
Hanks one.
mm.
And then I just remember they made such a big deal about how he said he prays for people by name, and I was like, oh my god, that's such a like OCD thing that I do. Like I'll just like do compulsions, be like, this is for this person, and then I'll be like random people I saw on the news who like got in a car accident and like doing that. I was like, oh, that's like this. So anyway, I'm digressing, but like, yeah, it's supposed to be like this. It was really therapeutic for me to just kind of sit and take that time for myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And somewhat related to our questions about power too, I know you talked about this piece as giving a ton of leeway to the performer. So the two people playing really get to shape like when they make a sound, when they're gonna do these notes you've written, and it seems to me that that's related to dynamics of power between the composer and then the performer. And I know you think about this with your work too, so I wondered if you could say a bit about how you think about yourself as a composer and how you connect to the performers through the notation. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I think that my sort of spirit around notation has changed quite a bit recently, especially. You know, I when I started composing, I was so like in finale. I would just like write notes and stuff. And like that was partly because I didn't it's so like the stuff that we like what I was saying about this like experimentation and like all this stuff, like all this really informs like the aesthetics of what we do and the notation and everything. And I think I really felt like I had to like take control in the situation, because when we're talking about these power dynamics, it was very rare that I was not working with a performer who was like a performer who wasn't white. So I it felt like I always had to like, you know,
Stay
rein it in.
your place.
But
I have decided all these things.
yeah, like I did this. So, and but then I feel like, with this piece, it's such a free piece. There's also like the tuning is like wonky and like, everybody has different tuning system. And like it was really free, and I wanted it to feel free and to feel like a hug when you're playing it. And I feel like as I've gotten a little bit more mature as an artist, I've like given up the control. And
Yeah.
I think it started by me writing music that was just really hard, and like not every performer would want to play it, or they might not be comfortable with that. And then I became really conscious of that. And then I started like writing in my score, like, oh, this is optional, this thing, but like if you can do it, that's great. Or like saying in this kind of space, like do this or something. And then that was like a stepping stone towards me like doing more of this kind of like the notation for the above the fray piece, where it's like a lot of this sort of like headless, with this like, or it's like half graphic. I've been doing a lot of like this half graphic, half notated stuff. So um yeah, and I think part of that is just because I'm becoming more aware. And also interestingly, in terms of power, I think I've gotten more powerful recently than I was when I
Mm,
started. So maybe I feel like this agency of like, oh, I can do this now that I
Yeah.
couldn't do before.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think.
We have in just the last few minutes of the hour, before we take a small break and then talk about glow up. There's a good question from our viewer, R. Chander, who we know who that is, but that
Hey,
might be
Rohan.
obvious in the chat. He was asking earlier about sort of your terminology and why specifically. I'm curious as to Nina's reason for using the word sampling versus quotation, if there's a distinction in your mind.
Hmm. I think so. And I think the academic answer is always like, oh, sampling is an electronic context, but quotation can be, like, I think that's like what the academic answer is, but
Mm,
I think I have a different answer. Um, in that I think it's like what the exchange is and like what is the point of it. I think sampling is something that's a lot more direct than like a quotation. Um, like a quotation, you're losing parts of something, right? So like in a way, I guess maybe in above the fray it was kind of a quotation in terms of because the instrumentation was different.
Mhm.
But then I also was like using the exact same notes. Like I was really being very strict about like what I was keeping from it, and it was like a very conscious thing, rather than something where I gave more leeway in terms of how it was used. And I think with sampling, when I'm talking about all this like identity exchange stuff,
Yeah.
like there's much more of a direct identity exchange, I think, with sampling than there is with
Yes.
quotation. Because quotation is just kind of like, like I'm paraphrasing another artist versus like I'm actually really like taking this and like there's going to be a direct exchange.
Yeah.
Um, and I think part of the thing with quotation is like when we're talking about all these issues of consent and things like that, like I think quotation tends to be a little bit safer in terms of that than
mm,
Yeah.
sampling is. Um, but I don't know if I'm answering the question. But that's how I approach it.
Yeah.
mhm,
And I find something sort of, when I hear sampling, I think more of the, you know, really the practice of, people in dance music, people in hip hop, sort of starting in the 20th century, like, really more often than not, a culture of music working and self-reference of people of color.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And there was such an obvious power thing there,
yeah.
right? With sampling in terms of like, for a hip hop artist and sampling, like the power dynamic means something really different than like for I don't know. I almost think quotation is like this really classical thing. It's
Yeah.
like
mm,
it's such a like classical concept.
yeah.
Like
Rohan's
such a
mentioned that in the
watered down
chat.
thing.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and I can see sort of if you think of like using a quotation in an article that you're writing or something like that, or in a paper, you're showing a big aspect of it is showing your almost your pedigree for your ideas.
Mm.
And there's almost like a there's like a um, uh, academic capital to
Mm.
to referencing and being able to show exactly where something came from, you know. Uh, Whereas with sampling, it seems more like, you know, a lot of times it's homage to something or it's making fun of something, but it's always in reference to the culture itself, you know. And I think a bit maybe there's like a there's cultural capital to like sampling something that's really obscure but like really good, and like that has a whole thing with like, you know, crate digging and things like that. But yeah,
And
that,
there's not that same element of preservation, I think,
yeah,
that's there, like quotation, with sampling. There really is this element of like reclaiming something when you
yeah,
sample. It's like this really like power thing to
yeah,
do. In a way that quotation is more this like, I want to preserve this other art.
yeah.
Mm.
I want backup, you know.
Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
Anyway, let's maybe take a 5 minute break.
And then we'll be back to talk about Glow Up.
Blow
So
up.
if you don't know that show, go watch it right now.
Watch it,
Go.
all of it.
All right,
It's on
we'll be back in
Netflix.
we'll be back in a few.
Okay.
Okay, and we're back with the second part of Hot Boys Talk Show.
Hot Boys Talk Show, where we're going to talk about something completely different. Nina has asked to talk about the Netflix/BBC show Glow Up, which, if you haven't watched it, it's real fun. There's 2 seasons right now. I feel like there's a third happening. It's basically Project Runway, but for makeup artists. There's drama, but not too much. I feel like BBC is much more civil, which I appreciate. But there's still for people who haven't watched Project Runway and don't know what that is, it's basically an elimination reality show where you have 10 contestants and they have different challenges and they're judged by celebrity judges and they're eliminated until you have a winner. And sometimes they get money. Sometimes I feel like this was you got it.
I think you get like a contract. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We should say cheap. Yeah. We should say too, we're going to try our best not to do any spoilers.
Yeah.
But if you haven't watched it and you're worried, we might spoil some stuff.
We might spoil a few things, but I watched one of the seasons in one day while I was working on something else.
You'll be fine. Yeah.
You'll be fine.
But yes, I think all 3 of us really enjoy the show. I watched it with my younger sister and we just really had to speed through it. It just felt so fun to watch. The challenges are really exciting, and the looks that you get from the contestants are really wide ranging. There's some that are really abstract, some that are more I guess gory or different styles of makeup.
Yeah, we see this kind of sort of horror princess Hannah.
Extra eye.
There's a lot of sort of this full face art, like painting makeup, but actually it's a little hard to find online. It's just the pictures. There's also a lot of just sheer beauty looks, for fashion shoots and things like that.
Right. The way that most of the episodes are broken down is the first part of the challenge is based around different types of makeup that would be needed in a professional setting. So a lot of it is fashion. Some of it ends up in musical theater or other TV shows.
Or the first season, they go to the Universal Harry Potter. Is it Universal? I don't remember.
Oh.
It's the Harry Potter studios, and they work with a really well-known prosthetics guy.
Right.
And they have prosthetics. You know.
And the second part is more their personal looks. They might on the first one they put it on themselves, and then later they're doing it to other people. So that's kind of the breakdown of this show.
So Nina, why'd you want us to watch this?
Oh my gosh, there's so much to talk about. So I watched it with my mom. So we honestly we first started watching it because my mom was like, maybe we'll learn something and we'll learn how to I've never been able to get if I wear eyeshadow to get it to be visible or something. Yeah. So my mom was like, maybe we'll learn how to do it. And that was honestly why we started watching the show. But then it was really entertaining. And for me, I feel like I've been thinking so much about what dictates aesthetics in other art forms, and even just thinking about the way that the judges critique, all these fields are so subjective. I mean, obviously there's a difference between the technique based challenges where it's how close is it looking to something else versus or can I put this prosthetic on my face or something versus the challenges.
Your idea.
And it was also interesting to see people that did really badly consistently in the briefs where it's just a technique based thing, but then they always did really well in the creative challenges. And I felt that one was an example of that. So
she always got put in the hot seat when she was asked to do something in a professional setting because she couldn't follow directions or work with other people. But then she would always get herself out and she was, I won't spoil anything, sorry. But then she would get herself out of the hot seat with her creative brief because she'd do stuff like that.
Yeah.
And
Really
she would
technical
make
work.
her own prosthetics like from home.
Yeah.
Right, right.
Um,
Yeah, it
yeah.
kind of like the way the show's built and who they decided to bring into the show really showed like what they care about in terms of uh, technique in the makeup industry. And it seemed to me like the people that did the best were the ones who their skills in makeup were adjacent to the fashion industry or things that would um, make them good at like looks that you'd see in a magazine or looks you would see on the runway. I don't know if that's like completely correct, but it felt like a lot of it was these technical things that related to like what do you want to see in the fashion world. And so these
Yeah,
other
the word
artists,
editorial, like
right?
is
Oh
what
yeah,
they always say. Mhm.
Editorial.
yeah.
There's,
So
there's
these
one judge. What's her name? Val.
Val
Uh-huh.
Garland,
Uh-huh.
Yeah. She's
yeah.
got a few, like there's always those like catchphrases, like, in Project Runway, it's like, you know, it's
Auf
just
Wiedersehen.
Heidi Klum going, "You're out," or something like that. Or sashay away.
Yeah.
And for Val, when she likes something, she says ding dong. But I think Nina wanted to do a Val impression, so I'm gonna let
Oh
her.
my God. Oh my,
Oh,
I'm
in the
like,
hot seat
my
now.
mom is gonna hear this. I'm like, oh God, I ding dong or something. I could do a better impression of like the host.
Yeah.
But, like,
Oh yeah. Oh my God. She's got a really thick accent.
Yeah, the hosts are I think the host is very like um the two that critique them can be pretty like they're in their face a lot. They're really telling them like this is bad. But then the host, she's very like kind and tries to like lift their spirits. I think they like work against each
Oh,
other in
honey,
that
I'm
way. Yeah.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I think the host also doesn't really come from. She's
The
actually a
world.
BBC reporter. And actually, I read that she faced a lot of criticism for her even like taking this position because
Hmm.
people thought like she's done a lot of these really serious like investigative reports on like places in the Middle East and things like that,
Hmm.
and
Serious things happen.
serious like yeah like people dying and stuff. Like she's done a lot of reports on that,
Yeah.
but then she did the show, and I think that's it's kind of sad that I mean she should do whatever she wants. So
Yeah, yeah. And this like I think maybe she's running up against being compared to like Tim Gunn,
Hmm.
mm,
who,
Who
if
is
you
in?
watch Project Runway, is
Yeah.
like the like fashionista man expert who is, pretty much the heart and soul of that show.
Yeah. Right.
Um, real quick, I know we weren't going to sort of get into particulars, but we have to talk about Ophelia of season 2 because
Yes.
good Lord, look at
Stunning
that.
looks.
This is the first creative look that she did. It was like day one. She pulls this out. She also has a lot of really, really gory things that I showed my roommate, and he made throw up noises.
So range. She's got range.
She's got range. But like we were talking before, is that there's an emphasis on technique, which you can see also in like Project Runway. She's got the technique to back up her execution of these things.
Mhm.
And I sort of like I feel like that's a very sort of common way to talk about arts.
Mhm.
It's a very digestible way for people who want to like feel like you know how when you watch the Olympics and you like feel like you can judge diving like after a bit, you know, and you're like, I don't agree. It's like I feel like that's kind of this like dichotomy of like technique and artist like creative idea is like the way that TV gets public into feeling like they can judge along the way.
Mm, yeah.
Also this look is meant to be the superpower of invisibility.
Oh, right.
I was blown away.
a lot of technical work to make all the
All the
like
like
the
the
illusion that it's
yeah.
cloth on her face. Right, which is it's interesting. Like I do think that we see in the show um, an overemphasis on critique, but it or technique, but it's a very specific type of technique, and I think that's something that I find interesting about. I didn't piece together the connection that the makeup industry has to a more editorial fashion forward thinking, and so I think even related to what we were talking about before, the power dynamics of who's going to win are based on who can sufficiently display technique that is sanctioned as technical. Because all of them are doing technical things. Like I cannot do any of that, you know? And I think there's a lot of people who can't. So there's, but the rules of engagement or the rules of who is allowed to be like celebrated as technical really do seem to come from the aesthetic of editorial looks and the fashion world. Um,
Yeah, I also felt like I mean, well, the show is set up, right? When they have that first challenge, like the brief challenge versus the other one, the
yeah,
brief one is always more like market oriented, right? Like
right,
you're in a fashion show, you're working under this client, this is you have to deliver and do, or like I think in the second season, the first challenge is like to do literally an ad campaign, you know?
right,
Yeah.
Versus the creative challenge, like is a totally different purpose. But then that also, like, of course there's like institutional aesthetics that like I was thinking so much of when like in the second season there is this one person who makes something and like it's funny because it like she makes a mask on the face and now it's like very relevant now, but like this is before all the
Yeah.
pandemic. But
Yeah.
then they say this thing like you went too literal, like there's this sort of like
Yeah.
aesthetic, right? Why,
yeah,
well, why is that not good, you know? And I think the makeup world is different than, you know, some other art forms in that like the what has happened recently, especially with things like YouTube and social media, is that it's kind of allowed a lot of makeup artists to kind of create their own audience, right?
hmm
They can put their own content out. They get to dictate this aesthetics just based on who
right,
watches their content in a way that maybe they hadn't been able to before. But then it's funny because like the criticism is always like that was so YouTuber or whatever. Like they look down upon that in a
right.
way that I even in our field sometimes there's like these critiques like that was so I don't know DIY or whatever
Yeah.
some
Whatever
genre.
the competing aesthetic is, yeah. I
Mhm.
think it's funny because even in the show, one of the, but this is a spoiler, so mute it if you
Get
don't want to know.
ready.
But there is a contestant who decides they don't want to be on the show anymore because they miss the way that you doing makeup on social media made them feel, and really honestly made them money. So
Yeah.
they found a way to like make a living with their art. So it speaks to your point that in a way there is this kind of like there's a separate space that's afforded now because people can connect on these different platforms for an artist like the one who dropped out. Like she doesn't have to um, stay within the competition. She's not concerned about being like efficiently editorial. She just left, you know.
I had a lot of fun doing makeup before, and I'm not having fun doing it now. So bye.
Yeah, yeah.
You
Which
know.
there are different.
I thought you were talking about yourself at first.
No, no, no,
I
no,
was like, that's so sad.
And of course there are different. It should be said that that's not the largest zoom out possible we could do, because obviously, you know, this person who can make money off of Instagram, who dropped out of the competition, she has another set of privileges and power structures that allow her to do that on social media. But it is just to say, it's interesting that the show allowed dissent in a way that they showed this person leaving, and didn't just like, I don't
Yeah.
know, like kind of brush over the fact that she left. Like they really did they make a moment of it in the show.
Yeah. And it's not too much of a moment. There isn't like a back and forth.
Sure, sure.
Will she not?
Right.
Yeah.
This is like I'm going. It's sad. And then there's a moment where like the judges are like, that's a bummer. I wish you would have just kept with it. But then that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they move on.
You know?
Mhm.
They also like that's maybe too much of a spoiler, but there's a thing they had to, later on they have to like change a challenge because they don't have enough people. Like one of the weeks they don't eliminate anybody because they lost somebody earlier on. So
Yeah,
you
yeah. So
see,
they're
you
like,
see, I can imagine the editors in the background, like, how are we going to figure this out? Like, she left. You know, they had to figure
And
out,
disguise it as
yeah,
like
yeah.
just
I was
how to
like,
build it
you
in.
guys did both, you know, did the challenge hot seat. I don't remember what it's called again.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, but it's, you know, you did so well, we couldn't decide. So you're both still here.
And
you're
this
like,
has nothing to do with the fact we like lost somebody earlier.
yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that I would think every time that someone came back from the face-off challenge, because they do the whole thing like the two people, like they're like, say your goodbyes because one of these two people will not be coming back into this room with couches. And then the person like comes back that's when the face-off, and they just like clobber the person with hugs. And I always wonder, like, are they told to do that? Because like
Yeah.
are they going to have the same, would they really have the same reaction to every person who came back where it's like tears
Yeah.
and like a bear hug pile?
They never show them fighting though. That's the thing.
I do
I mean, I
like
think that this maybe it's like a British reality show thing. like
yeah.
like the same kind of like British baking or Bake Off or the
Yeah.
Great whatever it's called. But like versus a lot of the way American reality shows are structured where it's like all about the drama.
Oh,
I-
And yeah, I mean there's
yeah.
so much in this show. Now I'm also thinking like there's also cultural aspects of this show, you know, and then they kind of like they insert it and then they just kind of move away from it.
Yeah.
And like I mean even Ophelia, the person you talked about, like has mentioned like her own choice of like the career and her family pressures. And then in the first season there's somebody named Paige, I think. And
Yeah.
like I think Paige even talks a lot about like the pressures and like the aesthetics of being a black makeup artist and like what even just like doing makeup on
Darker.
people of different skin colors and
Mhm.
that's you know something that in the makeup world is so embedded that like they've kind of been having to push a certain direction just because like people like Rihanna with Fenty have kind of pushed it in this direction of like, well, we're gonna do all this like really inclusive color matching and like so many tones. But you know, for a while before that, like there was like what 3 options or something for things. So
Mhm.
um
Well, it's also that like
yeah.
there were so many options for like the first three shades of like color, and then once you get deeper and deeper tones of skin, there's like two options.
Yeah.
You know, um,
Exactly.
I I should confess that I like watched a ton of ASMR YouTube makeup videos before, and some of them were just creators saying like this is a brand that actually has skin color that or foundation that matches my skin tone, and it became like a again to talk about social media like it's another channel to talk about the things that you actually need to talk about. And this made me think that in the shows, in any reality show, it's always non reality. It's like a fake reality. And the reason we know that is because there are certain topics that are not up for debate on these kind of shows. And I think any indication in Glow Up that was about cultural identity was really mediated by what there's an appetite to hear. So there
Yeah.
wasn't a conversation about skin tone and the lack of foundation colors, you know?
Yeah. I remember actually the most cringy episode of the first season for me was the drag episode, not only because so many of those people did not know how to like do drag makeup. Like everyone did horrible. in
That was the one with kimchi, right? Kimchi is such
Yeah,
a
kimchi's in there, yeah.
I feel like kimchi was let down, but one thing, like actually the person that they liked, the makeup that they liked, the creative brief, that person talked about how like they were given the challenge to do basically like showing commentary on gender with makeup.
Mm.
And what they were looking for mostly was just binary drag, which drove me nuts to begin with. But
Right.
the person who they liked the most sort of ended up, I mean, kind of doing a cool thing of this sort of collage of both, we'll say. But at the same time, when she was talking in the beginning, I'm like, what's your plan? And she was like, well, I really like this one person because, you know, he just lets himself, you know, wear a dress some days if he wants to, and maybe not wear a dress some days if he doesn't want to. I just think that's really cool to keep it fluid like that. And I was just like, this cis person like is just thinking about gender right now.
On the spot.
In this moment.
At Glow Up.
Yeah, at Glow Up, you know. And I was
But-
like, there's so little like,
Mm.
you know, makeup has such a, I feel like queerness was just so tinily lightly touched on in all of this when it was, you know,
which is so surprising.
Right.
I was really surprised that they didn't really, I don't know, I was like hoping in a way that this show would like, it's such a big part of it. And you know, like even just like the whole history of makeup, I think it has gone from, I think like a way to cover up stuff, like cover up a blemish or something, to like a way of a form of empowerment, you know, and really like taking control of it, of like your identity and the way other people perceive you, and just like really feeling like to be yourself. But like they didn't really like, the way that they talked about makeup was so, it was so like gendered in like a binary way that was really like disappointing, I think, for me.
Yeah, it was, you know, no one knew how to block brows correctly.
Yeah, that also, except there was one person I think who
was Ellis, because he did drag.
Exactly.
You know, for years. And I guess it was like, I think it was unfair to ask people to figure out how to do drag makeup. Even I went back and forth because I feel like so much of YouTube is drag artists doing tutorials, you know, so it's like, oh, come on, why didn't you learn that?
Yeah. But again, it's like,
it's very involved, you know, and everyone just failed so bad. It's like how many people, it killed me. So blocking eyebrows for the uninitiated is the way that that artists who want to put a different eyebrow on entirely get rid of their eyebrows. They cover it in layers of glue and then powder and then foundation. And so many people went through this painful process of blocking the eyebrows down and doing a so-so job on it, and then drawing an eyebrow on the existing eyebrow. That was the real thing that I could not stand. I was like, the whole part of this is that you're supposed to do an eyebrow above the eyebrow.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
But right. I mean, again, it's like the decision of what's sufficiently technical is mapped to a very particular invisible identity. And that's where I think the problems of the show come up for me, is just about like, there's a lack of like imagining this artist is really good at what they do. It's not the type that we expected, or that is like part of the fashion industry, but we still would want to applaud them and help them win. So
anyway, it is 1 minute away from 5:30. We gotta wrap it up.
Thank you, everyone.
It's 8:30 for me.
Oh, so, wow. Yeah.
It's dinner time.
It is dinner time. Well, thank you, everyone, for watching. And thanks so much, Nina, for coming and sharing all your thoughts. We're really grateful to have you on.
So real quick, next week, we have Victoria Chea coming, and we'll see what she wants to talk about.
Right. We'll be doing that we'll do the show every 2 weeks. So we should have this date down. But what's the date of that day?
It's the 19th.
Yes, the 19th. Victoria Chea will be on. Cool. Okay.
All right.
Be safe, everyone. Bye.